Thank you for joining us this morning. As Dr. Schultz mentioned, we're here to talk a little bit about the work that Reimagine Minnesota has been doing. You can see we have the 9 strategies. The strategy that we're going to focus on today is recruitment and retention, developing and building systemic strategies for recruiting and retaining staff of color. So I want to start by just telling you that this work in Minneapolis public schools has been timely work. And when I came into the district almost 3 years ago, equity was at the forefront of the conversation, specifically around the fact that our students are not at the level academically or achievement where we want them to be. And then, of course, the well-known gap that we have, whether you want to call it an opportunity gap or an academic achievement gap, it's there, it's present. And from my experience, it's present in many districts, not only in Minnesota, but across the nation. So this discussion around recruitment and retention of people of color, we know more and more research out there stating that if students see themselves in their teachers, they have a greater potential for success in the world. What's really significant in what I'm going to share with you today, at least from the Minneapolis Public Schools experience, is that our data trend seems to be moving positively upward in terms of numbers. When you look at the number of teachers of color that we've increased in our district, we're jumping almost 10 percentage points, and you think that's great. It's incremental, though, and that word incremental is one that is really difficult because everything we seem to be doing lately has been incrementally positive. And so there's a level of urgency. But when you further unpack that information, you take the data, then you start looking at the more qualitative part of it, the feedback that we get from our staff. It's extremely concerning what their lived experiences are. So we have an increase in our numbers, but the lived experiences of our teachers of color, is not positive. And that's very tough as a leader to take, to hear that information. And it's also very easy to say that if that's how our teachers feel, imagine how our students feel. And for me, that's what drives the work, is the experience of our students. And we know that they have to have positive role models in front of them in order to feel successful. So we're going to share a little bit of that today, and I want you to think about, as you do this work in your district, examining how your staff reflects the students that you serve and the families that you serve, and see if you have that alignment in terms of the students you're serving and the families and what your staff looks like in support of those students and families. And then have you also considered your district's policies, your practices, and do those policies and practices encourage or discourage people of color to work in your district? And then finally, have you considered what it's like for a person of color or a student of color to exist in your district or be a part of the system? So I hope you'll gain something from these presentations around what that means for where you are as a district, where you are as a leader, and then hopefully get some ideas and strategies to help build on your current state of things. So with that, I'm going to invite up 2 of my colleagues from Minneapolis Public Schools, Maggie Sullivan, who's our Chief of Human Resources. And so she, along with members of her team, have helped take on this work around our equity and diversity impact assessment, specifically related to the recruitment and retention. That's a big part of their work. And then also our Chief of Accountability, Research, and Equity, Eric Moore. He also serves as our current interim of Chief of Academics. So together, these two have led a group of educators in Minneapolis Public Schools through this process, which, as I said, is quite complex. They'll share a little bit about that, and more importantly, they'll share the findings. They'll share where we are now and what action steps we're taking to really begin addressing these conversations that we've been having for a number of months. And I will also just conclude by saying these data that we're going to be looking at are representative of Minneapolis, but they're also, I believe, representative of every single district, not only across the nation, but in Minnesota as well. If you have children of color, if you have staff of color, then I'm sure you can apply some of these experiences to your situation as well. So with that, Maggie and Eric, let's give them a round of applause, and thank you.
Thank you for having us. So as the superintendent mentioned, we've been committed to doing this work for quite some time, really looking at how we recruit, support, and retain staff that better reflect the diversity of our students, because we know that is absolutely critical to the success of our students, especially our students of color. We did take a step back over this last year and just say, how are we doing? What's working, what's not working? Through this equity, diversity, impact assessment work, we really went deep and have been committed to this work. And as the superintendent mentioned, while our data trends are positive, incremental but positive, we unearthed some really deep systemic challenges that we want to share with you today and work to address them. So we only have 30 minutes, so we'll be moving pretty quickly, but wanted to just share some context as well as our current progress, what the EDI process is, what we found, and what we plan to do about it. And again, this is a work in progress. It is important work, but it's systemic work. So, turn it over to Eric.
Good morning. This is like the ultimate job interview. I'm looking at all of you here and I'm sitting here.
It's not allowed.
This is so interesting. I just want to, the historical context, it's important to place this work in the historical context, I think, because if you think about the first state-sponsored schools in which we were, preparing teachers and for the work that we currently do today, nestled that prior to when slavery ended in 1863 to 1865. So you have the establishment of our educational system in schools, while you also have a system of slavery, and we've all been educated to the fact that this is the story of resistance and strength for many of our folks of color who were reading often by fire and candlelight, often at great cost, physically and emotionally. And then you have Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, which is your separate but equal doctrine. Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. What's interesting is prior to 54, there's a court case, McLaurin versus Oklahoma, University of Oklahoma, 1950, which actually eliminated the separate but equal doctrine in higher education. And I attended Lancaster University in Oklahoma and actually had relatives during that period of time. My grandmother when she went to pursue her graduate degree, was at the University of Oklahoma getting her graduate education in a separate room. In fact, so while the professor taught the predominantly white classroom, she was behind a barrier on the side and was able to receive her education that way. The point is that the educational experiences of people of color, both in the classroom as well as educators, has changed tremendously. It was very different. You had Board of Education 54. The 80s found a lot of work in alternative licensure because, and I would argue because of the historical context, that we weren't getting the number of teachers of color that we had hoped. And so you see this alternative licensure, and then 2003, you see court cases involved with affirmative action. And again, when you look at the numbers of teachers of color relative to our student of color population, we don't see a lot of differences. We haven't seen a lot of progress. And so as the superintendent mentioned, the progress has been certainly incremental. National trends, as the superintendent mentioned, the education system is a predominantly white system. In fact, it's about 10%. When you look at other fields of study, it's actually 10% less diverse. I think it's 73% of those that go into the teaching field are white. When you look at other fields, on average, it's about 62%. So it's a predominantly white field, and I would attribute that, if you look at some of the historical context. You also see that nationally, teachers of color talk about facing racial stereotyping, being pigeonholed in disciplinary roles. And so when we talk about the work of the EDIA in Minneapolis, it certainly mirrors the trend across the United States, I would argue across all of our districts in Minnesota. And as I've shared this in other settings, we also see within different organizations, it mirrors that. That if you are one of a few people of color in a law firm, for example, some of the findings may mirror that. We also know that we have lower retention rates for our teachers of color. The supply is a conversation that we've had for years. In fact, in our state, I think 28% we have 28% students of color. Our teacher of color force is 4%. In Minneapolis, there's 65% students of color, and our teachers of color is 17%. So again, you see this wide disparity. And then the other piece I want to mention, in terms of teachers of color and why they leave the profession, about 50% identify they leave the profession nationally because they're just dissatisfied with their work. And so you really get into, as we've started looking at the EDIA, looking at the traditional measures of recruitment, hiring, and retention, but we really got into significant conversations about the quality of experience, about the teachers enduring work environments, but certainly not being able to be their best selves because of a series of microaggressions, in which we'll speak to today with the EDI findings. So we've had a policy in the district called 1304, was passed in 2013. I won't read the policy to you completely, but what I do want to point out, I think at the 4th line, the policy, I think, I'm very proud of being a part of a district that in board policy discusses institutional racism. The policy also compels us as adults to eliminate those practices that perpetuate the achievement gap. And so that's significant, because I think when I've looked at other districts and policies, you don't see the institutional racism named explicitly in board policy. And so it focuses on adult practices and what we need to do to eliminate the achievement gap. We also have school-based equity teams at all of our sites, and so we've been very fortunate through our QComp funding to provide a stipend for teacher leaders. So each of our schools have what we call an equity lead. And so we're able to have an equity framework, but we provide professional development for those equity leads, and then they lay the foundation in the school. So the work we're always trying to do is go from a framework, a way of knowing and doing, and then go moving towards action by identifying people in buildings that can really move the work. We've had an equity framework in place. We've recently revised the process of revising the equity framework. There's 4 areas of the equity framework: pedagogy of equity, which gets into our curriculum and instructional practices; families as community partners, really focusing on how do we have parent voice drive a lot of, and community voice drive the work that we do; the EDIA process, as the superintendent mentioned; and operations, which focuses on professional development for our teachers as well as our staff. We also have started an equity considerations process in which we're looking at equity and budgeting. And one of the things that we've really started to do as a district is, as we're having conversations about equity, we're trying to align those conversations with our budgetary process, right? Because from my experience, and I've been in education for over 20 years, we do a lot of talking about equity and about how we need to treat each other differently, but the institutional change really rests within the budgets, right, and the extent to which you can move work. And so what communities often, communities are very savvy, and they're looking at where do you put your dollars? Where's the accountability behind the work that you're doing? And so this has been a process in which we are aligning our findings, our research, our engagement with our communities with our budget process and our accountability process. And so I think that's been really important for us.
So as Eric's mentioned, we've laid quite a bit of groundwork when it comes to the equity work in the district. We've also done some work in terms of the HR around recruitment and retention, staff of color. A few things just to mention: we've increased and done more targeted recruitment. We've launched teacher residencies. I think we're in year 4 of our teacher residencies here at the district, doing both elementary and special ed, and this is by far our most diverse pipeline. We've developed really close relationships with our higher ed partners, really trying to showcase our need. We meet annually with them, share our data. We've built them dashboards to show kind of who their candidates are, who are coming to us, what the diversity of that is, how many stay with us. We've improved onboarding, developed a much more robust new teacher orientation as well as new employee orientation. And then, like I said, committed to participating in this EDIA process. So we've tried to build a foundation and start this work and go deep. And with this EDIA process, which we started last year, it was really trying to understand where are we and how are we doing. I would say the EDI is a great way to look at both quantitative and qualitative data. We engage with, I think, about 16 community organizations who work with us through this, who analyze the results with us, who give us feedback. And I would just say it's a deep space of self-examination and reflection. I think being the head of division that's responsible for a lot of this work, this requires us to be very transparent about where we are, what is working, what's not working, and really committed to change. And that is hard. I think also standing in front of our communities and from our board, in front of our teams, and being transparent about the results, standing in front of all of you, I think it's really challenging, but really critical to moving this forward.
Goes without saying, so the EDA process is an iterative process in which we're bringing an issue to the community-based organizations that you see on the screen. I think there's roughly 14 of them, and we're constantly recruiting. But we identify the issues identified in this sense. It was doing an EDA on recruitment, retention, hiring. But there's a learning process that occurs. It's taken us a year to do this work. And that wasn't necessarily at the beginning by choice. It was because it took that much time to really have a shared understanding of the topic. I think often our learning was that when we're engaging with different communities, we don't take the amount of time to really equalize power so that we have the same understanding, a shared understanding of the topic. And so these community-based organizations asked us to slow down. And when we slowed down, we actually were able to learn a bit more from them and their perspective on the topic. And so we shared data with the EDIA committee. They asked questions. We came back with additional information. We did data collection. We made meeting together. We collectively put together the recommendations. And so the recommendations that came forward from this EDA process came from these community-based organizations after examining data together. And then we presented our action steps. Our action steps are primarily from the recommendations of the EDIA committee. We're in the process now of developing our accountability process. So now every quarter, we actually go back to the EDI committee to tell them, share our action steps, progress on our action steps. And so there's a shared accountability there. I will share with the EDI process as well as that as a school district, we don't necessarily have to implement everything they're asking us to implement. Right? And in fact, some of the things may not be feasible. But the accountability to the community is that the report is front-facing. That is that our communities, surrounding communities, can see this EDI report. They can see what the community recommended relative to the findings. They can see them to what extent did we follow those recommendations, what our action steps are, and then we continue to be engaged. And I'll share with you that what was wonderful is as we presented these findings, having representatives of the EDI committee present, shared a really nice message in the sense that we're doing this work together. And so you see representatives from a variety of different locations. Just from a methodological standpoint, what I will share is that we found it really important to do qualitative work as well as quantitative. And that, again, was driven by the community, the need to share the true experiences. Oftentimes we present the quantitative data because you're able to do it fairly quickly and is pretty cost effective. But the reality is that a sampling methodology doesn't necessarily reflect or honor really intense and honest experiences of our teachers and communities of color. And so we did a mixed methods approach in which we did focus groups. We did 4 focus groups with teachers of color. We also did in-depth interviews with about 10 teachers of color. We engaged with our school leaders. We did 20 in-depth interviews with our school leaders. We did 51, additional 51 of our principals and assistant principals were surveyed. And then in the human resource department, we really took the time to examine exit survey data. So we looked at the exit data from 195 teachers, 40 of which were teachers of color. We had in-depth interviews with our HR directors. And then we looked at existing data personnel data for the past 5 years. So that would have been school year 14 to school year 18. And to try to get a full perspective from the teachers, from our building leaders, as well as from those teachers that are exiting, and then just the hard quantitative data that we traditionally look at.
So we first started by looking at our quantitative data, and I'm sure like many of you report this to your board every year, looking at the percent of our new hires, which are teacher of color. So we went from about 17% to 29% over the last year. We hire about 400 teachers a year. So this has been a significant increase for us. I would say two things on that. One, if we wanted to get to the space of on this trajectory where our staff reflects our students, it would take us a better part of a century moving forward. So this is, to the superintendent's point, very incremental work. We only moved from 14 to 17% in terms of teacher of color throughout the district, just given the sheer size of the district. I would also say if we wanted to get that number closer to 50%, we would have to hire virtually every single teacher of color licensed by the state of Minnesota. So that's just part of the reality of where we are, which is why we've also built out things like our Grow Your Own networks. So we looked at this and said, well, we're moving in the right direction. We need to accelerate it, but this is a positive trend. We also looked at our, retention data. And I think to our surprise, to some extent, surprise of our board, our retention has been pretty consistent and pretty similar between teachers of color and our white teachers. So we looked at that and said, okay, what do we need to do? What do we need to do next? And this is where I think it's easy to stop here and say, you know what, we don't see much disparities here. We see we're moving in the right direction. But part of the work at the EDIA is really going deeper and saying what's really going on. So like Eric said, we did a lot of quantitative research, spent a lot of time with focus groups, talking to our principals, and identified a number of barriers, which we'll get into. Charlie, do you mind clicking for me? First, I'd say the findings, we have a lot on these slides. We're not going to read through all of them. They're in your agenda packet, so you can read through. Part of what we wanted to showcase was not just the findings, but the voices of our teachers of color, because the themes were consistent. And I think it's very easy to say, well, that's not our policy, that's not our practice, but this is a lived experience that came up over and over and over again, and at some point you need to say, even though it's not our considered practice, this is the lived experience and what is actually happening on the ground, and we need to acknowledge it and address it. So one, we know we have a limited pool of teachers of color, and that's a lot of systematic barriers that everybody in this room faces. Number of diverse candidates in teacher prep programs, rigid licensure requirements, it's limited us from going out of state. We've also heard from our teachers of color, they felt like we were doing much more passive recruitment. And part of that was the timing of our recruitment. Part of it was that just the resources we were putting towards recruitment. And we also heard a lot about unclear roles with our school leaders. Who was responsible ultimately for recruitment? We've got 70 schools with 70 different communities and one HR department centrally. So that was really a finding we heard from both of our principals, our HR, and our teachers. And then I think just a level of frustration from our teachers about, do we really value this? Does it show up in our recruitment messages? Is it consistent across all of our schools and our HR department? So just to highlight some of these quotes, I'll just read one. This is from an ESL teacher. It's a nightmare. I'm certified as an ESL teacher from another state, but they won't give me an ESL certification here. They want me to go back to school, get another 30 hours. Why would I do that? I've been certified in teaching for 12 years, and you want me to go back to school, and you know how much that will cost. That is kind of a consistent message we're getting from out-of-state teachers. We try to recruit. We do some recruitment out-of-state. We hear from out-of-state teachers who want to come back to Minnesota and just hear that the barriers or the perception of the barriers are so high. I do think that'll change pretty dramatically with the PELSB changes, but that's been something part of our reality now. I'll keep moving. So another big finding for us was looking at just the challenges in hiring. Part of this is due to our contract. We have what we call interview, select, matching, and placement. That's our internal transfer process. As dictated by our contract. It's a pretty robust process that leaves us hiring external candidates usually in June. So that really limits our ability to hire the best qualified candidates and our most diverse candidates. And it really is challenging for our school leaders who are like, I've got this phenomenal candidate, but I can't hire them yet. It also, when we do face budget cuts, when we've done this analysis, because of our recruitment and hiring trends, our teachers of color are disproportionately impacted by any budget cuts. So they're likely the first to be cut in our schools, the first to be without positions, and or be in excess and have to go through the transfer process, which feels like an incredible burden for them and is. We also have a very decentralized hiring process. Again, with 70 schools, as an HR team, we've got some pretty strict rules, but the interviews happen at the school level, and so the experience our teachers have varies dramatically. And I think the last piece was just understanding the process. It's a very complex process with moving pieces, all dictated kind of by the contract, so that becomes a challenge as well. So I just want to quote, the timing of interview and select for MPS puts us at a disadvantage for hiring when compared to other districts. By the time we figure out that we might be able to rehire some of the people we laid off, they've gotten jobs in other districts. And I can see very clearly, I mean, we had a massive budget deficit this last year. We had a number of staff of color that our principals wanted to retain, but they just couldn't wait. And said, we got jobs in other districts. Why would I be part of a district that will not commit to trying to keep me?
One of the things that, as we did the EDIA, I mean, as Chief Sullivan mentioned, it was the quality of experience. So you see that the retention data looks similar, and we've made a lot of progress on recruitment. But the lived experience was something that I think really came out. And so this challenging work environment due to the perception of being assigned based on race. The belief that as your teacher of color, your only value is being placed in environments in which there are large populations of students of color. In fact, our teachers of color had a perception that the interview process looked very different depending on the population of the school. And the feeling that they were being assigned to those schools, the priority schools, or now the North Star schools identified. Being held to different standards than white colleagues while receiving messages that they're not meeting those expectations. So feedback, the perception that the feedback from their principals looked very different because of their skin color. The negative interaction with school communities was documented, and that HR and school leaders knew about this issue. Now, as we're sharing these findings of the EDIA, one of the things that I want to point out is that there isn't a process of finger pointing, in fact, because every level of the system has a role to play. That would be the system in terms of the policies, practices, and the board, owned by the board and the superintendent and the direct reports to the cabinet. The school leaders, you'll see a theme of school climate and what can a school leader do to create a space for dialogue. And then it's the individual microaggressions amongst the teachers. And in fact, how do we, on a day-to-day basis, informally interact in the teacher's lounge, in the hallway, and as we're enduring bus and cafeteria duty and those types of things. So, this is work that we have to do across all levels of the system. Okay. So, for example, a teacher would say, I've never felt welcome by my white peers. I'm constantly given the crap shifts and treated by fellow teachers as though I should serve them as a support staff rather than appear with the same credentials, right? And below that, there's extra scrutiny. You get it from the parents, you get it from the students themselves, you certainly get it from your colleagues in administration. You're constantly doing everything that you're expected to do and more. So again, this theme of teachers of color having to deal with the discipline issues, particularly around African American males. And then what is our responsibility within our buildings, if we have a teacher club, to provide the professional development for white teachers to also be able to effectively educate our students of color. Okay, so that was a theme and a perception that resonated. Also feeling excluded and unwelcome in buildings, feeling responsible for modeling respectful and inclusive interaction with white colleagues. And again, this theme of people are aware of these issues. And we do that, I believe, a lot with equities. We raise the issue, but the challenging piece is always the action step. How do we engage in systematically coming up with a series of action steps and holding ourselves accountable for doing the work? And then reporting back to our communities, our constituencies, that work has been accomplished. And so even when those issues have been raised, our teachers talked about the fact that they didn't see much progress. And sometimes we need to spend more time monitoring process and telling the story of process and the steps that we're taking to change things, rather than always going to the outcome, and that perhaps that data point rarely moves. Okay. A quote, I'm the only person of color, mainstream teacher. I feel the pressure. I'm the only voice of color in the room. We're doing this equity work. We're talking about this. I've heard this so many times. I've never felt really included. It feels very isolating, right? And so how many times, and I can share as my own experience even as a student of color, if you're in a predominantly white environment, speaking on behalf of people of color, okay? And so the theme of what's the responsibility of our principals to create opportunities where you can talk about race without relying upon that one or two teachers of color to carry the voice of people of color. And so that was a piece that came up. And what I'd encourage you to do is just, you have this in your packet and just read the quotes. And so I would share when we shared this at our school board meeting, I'll have to share that it was a very emotional experience. And that, these quotes are resonating over and over, and so the themes certainly become very salient. This idea of insufficient technical support. So what are we doing explicitly to make sure that teachers of color have opportunities to talk to teachers of color? So that would be your affinity groups, for example. The limited onboarding process. How are we really preparing our teachers of color as they come in for, in some cases, being one of few teachers of color in a building? And are there conversations we can have, or are there technical supports we can build in there? And so this idea of in the exit survey, for example, and this is, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. I know we're running out of time, but the exit survey, really, this is where the quantitative data supports the qualitative. And so you see the Minneapolis, the one question is, Minneapolis policy rules and procedures were clearly communicated to them. 53% of teachers of color indicated that the communication was strong compared to 66% of white teachers. They knew what was expected of them in their jobs. 65% of teachers of color, 79% of whites. The reality is their job matched what they expected when they were hired. 44% of teachers of color compared to 62% of whites. They understood how their work aligned with the goals and strategic direction of our district. 59% of teachers of color, 69% of whites. So sometimes when we do this, the equity training, the individual equity training, the reason we do this process of self-reflection is really get our unconscious biases that we have in interacting with people across different races, right? And perhaps that unconscious bias or that discomfort we have in providing honest feedback, which is a gift, gets in the way of these teachers of color, in some cases, improving, right? And feeling that they're fully included in the process. So that evaluation, this really signals to us that we need to do a better job on really providing feedback across racial lines. And I would argue that, again, this is something that I would invite you to examine across your own districts. Because, again, this is an informal piece that our teachers of color were recognizing. Okay. Similar themes, the adaptive supports, HR does not provide support directly to teachers, the feeling of not being supported by leaders. So again, going back to the quantitative piece, establish work rules and ensure that they were followed. 55% of teachers of color felt that they were communicating about work rules compared to 71% of whites. Provided clear direction, 39% of teachers of color, 55% of whites. Okay. Perception of fairness and opportunities and support for all team members, 46% of teachers of color, 59% of whites. Gave them feedback on their work. And think about the gift of feedback, both positive and constructive. 47% of teachers of color, 59% of whites. Were receptive to feedback. So now the perception of teachers of color providing feedback to their superior and other teachers on how we can better educate and support students of color. Receptive feedback, suggestions, new ideas. 39% of teachers of color, 60% of whites. Okay, so there's certainly a lot of work to do, and this is we talk about the quality of experience and the extent to which you feel heard is the extent to which you feel valued. And if you don't feel valued, how are you doing your best work? So there's also an opportunity for us to have our teaching force within our school communities even stronger if we, and this is what we're choosing to do as a district, having the courage to really engage in this issue at the policy level, the principal leadership level, as well as working with the MFT, our teachers union, at the individual level. Okay. And so I think we should probably move forward. You want to go to the action steps because I think that that's really important. You have this in your packet. But, this feeling of being targeted, probationary teachers, right? So as we bring our teachers of color in, they're probationary. To what extent are they fearful for their jobs because of the contract and seniority? And so that creates a job security issues as well. So I'm going to go to the action steps because because I think it's important to get to the plan of action.
So I would just say we've got some action steps. They're mostly technical solutions to what is fundamentally an adaptive problem, but it's where we're starting. I would also say 2 of the hardest meetings we've had about this were both with our principal union leadership and our teacher union leadership. I think this message was difficult but resonated across the system, and I think we all felt not implicated, but an ownership over this work. And we did come through with 2 deep letters of support, both from our principals union and our teachers union, to work collectively to address this. So we're not in this alone. And I think there is kind of systematic buy-in to doing something different, but it's going to require us to do some different work.
I just wanted to interject here for a moment and state just how much background work has gone into this process. I mean, I think the caution I would have from people is you hear this and you go, we need to go do this tomorrow. And I'm not I'm not saying you shouldn't be doing it, but this has been going on for many years, and this whole EDIA, I don't think we really described how complex it is. But the fact that we had specific interviews with individuals, we had to first identify the individuals who'd be willing to come forward and share their story. And as a person of color, when you're doing that, and this was shared from individuals, you're now out there publicly. And everyone begins to look around the room and say, who had that? Who's experiencing that? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of work that had to go into thinking about this. And as Maggie mentioned, the 2 probably most difficult conversations were with our principal leaders and our teachers, because they are actually noted in these discussions as well as being people who are part of this system. So I want to make sure we highlight that this is a significant amount of work, and yet, as you'll learn here from our action plan, we're still not there. We now have to go through and implement the action plan. So just wanted to make sure that everyone understood that. And we can certainly talk later about what that EDIA process looks like and how that has progressed and morphed.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Sure. I think Superintendent mentioned, goes without saying that you know, within school districts, and I'll say in Minneapolis, we've talked about these issues for a number of years. And then what happens is the people that you're asking to bare their souls and share their stories is a painful process. I mean, and I thank you, Superintendent, because we can't underestimate how challenging it is to ask people of color to come forward and talk about their experiences that they're enduring on a regular basis. I mean, sometimes the defense mechanism is to put your head down and continue to do the work and support our students. And the teachers have mentioned that they're there as they're talking about some of the challenges they're facing. They're there because they love the students and they are committed to our district. So there's that challenge of asking them to trust you again, and then not following through on the work. And so this is where the action steps become really important, because we have to build in that accountability structure. Now, the positive thing is as we start following through and we start delivering on our promise, what we're expecting to see, and we're seeing it now, in small ways, is more engagement, more full engagement, more engagement of those folks that we've talked to make our system better. And so people are now re-engaging more, but I think it was a challenging process to get people to come forward and tell their story again that they've done in many years and in many organizations. So I would say, to the superintendent's point, if you're going to go down this road, there has to be a deep commitment to action. Otherwise, things could be worse, because you're just reiterating the same story that many people have been told. We care, we want to address these issues, but then there's no follow through.
I would add a deep commitment to action and transparency. I think it's very easy in our roles to try to go into organization protection mode, but part of this is being really transparent about what our findings are, and to Eric's point, what our action steps are. I'll go through our plan really quickly. We built this plan in partnership with the EDI committee, so those 14 organizations took the findings, took all the data, and worked with us to come through what they thought would be some solutions that would help. I would say even if we went forward and met all of our action items that we have, I don't know that Minneapolis is still going to be yet a place where all of our staff feel supported to be their authentic selves, but it's a step forward in the right direction. And Mike mentioned many of these are going to be done based from HR and things that HR can impact, but this is really a system-wide issue that's going to require ownership and buy-in from every level of the organization. So just some of the concrete things. We're going to continue our ongoing commitments, things like our career trajectories, improving onboarding, our residencies, exit reflections. But really when we go into the new commitments, let me just move forward quickly. We are going to, again, as Eric mentioned, budget's such a critical part of this, really try to invest more heavily in recruitment. So looking at another recruitment coordinator to really focus on this work specifically, and some additional money in our recruitment budget, given the changes in policy, looking at what we can do differently with our communities and with our out-of-state networks. We're also going to deepen the way we train our hiring managers, so our principals, and our interview teams. Because it's not just our school leaders, it's those interview teams, and it's the experience that our candidates have when they walk in that door, who is on the interview team, what kind of questions they ask, how they're greeted, and how consistent that is across the district. We are going to be looking, as we mentioned, we continue to work with our higher ed partners. Our annual event this year, and this was really at the recommendation of our EDIA committee, was to really reframe it and listen to the voices of our teachers of color. What were their experiences in their preparation program? What are their experiences like in Minneapolis public schools now? And what can we both learn from that? And then how do we come forward together with joint action? And then we'll really be looking at PELSB, the new rules, and seeing what we can do differently in terms of recruitment. In terms of support and retention, one thing that came up was the need to have a mediator. I think there's a lot of the microaggressions that Chief Moore mentioned that don't necessarily rise to a formal complaint you send to HR or to EEO, but is you need somebody to call to say, my colleague touched my hair, I don't know what to do. I need somebody to talk through this with, help me process it, and potentially mediate at my school. Not a level of an HR formal complaint or an EEO complaint. It could get there, but just somebody to call to be that safe space, that trusted space and support for our employees. That was something that was really important, both for our teachers and for the EDIA committee. We are going to be doing what we call kind of in-person reflections or feedback sessions for all of our teachers of color who are leaving the district, just offering that to really hear from them, hear their stories, and learn from them. We're looking at increasing our mentorship for our new teachers through our PAR mentor program, and again, that's partly supported by QComp. And then we're looking at eliminating disparities from our contract. We know that's a process that's in works. We'll be going back into negotiations end of the month, but that's something we really need to be clear about. And part of this is being able to come forward and say, this is what we have found. This is the language that's causing this. How do we work together and come up with something that's not going to perpetuate the inequities that we know are happening because of current language? So like I said, this is not just HR. We're also turning some of the work over to our colleagues and Eric's shop as well.
We were able to through negotiations, we've added some, reduce the number of student contact days, and then we were able to use those days then for professional development. So we're going to take 1 day focusing on equity. And I would say equity, really looking at awareness. I think just symbolically, right, having every teacher in our district focus on self-awareness, self-reflection, will be significant. We have 4 priorities: equity, social and emotional learning, multi-tier systems of support, and literacy. And so those are 4 days. Right? We'll have a day for each, and we'll integrate those concepts. But really going deep into professional development and self-examination. We're going to, as referenced, and these are, again, items that the community, the teachers of color that we interviewed, our principals, and our EDI committee, recommended. So this isn't just coming from us as central office folks. Having affinity groups for teachers of color. So there was a request that there needs to be a safe space for people of color to talk to people of color, and that be informal. But we will ensure that happens. We'll continue to look at data, and we'll triangulate our findings from HR data with our culture and climate. So looking at the relationship between the recruitment, the retention, and then the perception of a positive space, right, and the perception of positive climates. We're adding additional equity coaches, and that's an idea. This is what's great about our work together. This is something I will mention that St. Louis Park has done for a number of years, so their work around equity coaches. And so we've hired additional equity coaches to support our principals and having informal conversations along with our associates. But in addition, with our equity leads. I mean, I mentioned earlier we have equity leads in each of our buildings, and so those equity leads, those equity coaches will support the equity leads and the equity teams in each of the buildings and provide professional development. Again, those groups meet monthly. So what's exciting is that we have an equity framework and we have a larger picture or framework of doing professional development. We do that in training with our equity leads as well as our principals. Then they're able to take that work in the building. But again, what we're trying to establish is a shared understanding of equity. Right? What does equity mean? How does it look in terms of practice, in terms of how you build a schedule, and how do you interact with families, et cetera, and then the day-to-day interactions. And then we also, this is really exciting. So how many of you have heard of the IDI, Intercultural Development Inventory? So we're doing that. All of our principals will be taking the IDI and assistant principals in February. We're also, our entire, led by the superintendent and cabinet will be taking that IDI, as well as all our central office staff. What the IDI will allow us to do is have a district profile. So it gives you a profile in terms of culture. We'll be able to look at the differences between culture, which is ways of knowing and doing, how you have the informal rules of what success and excellence looks like amongst cabinet versus your principal group versus your central office group, and have some deep conversations about culture. And are there ways of knowing and doing that perhaps is a dominant culture, district culture, middle income, white culture of ways of knowing and doing that may get in the way of people being their best selves and participating. And so we're doing some deep self-examination with the IDI, and I think what's exciting about that is it also comes with coaching. And so then you have your individual profile where you can do your individual work as well as your group work. And so that's some of the work that we're embarking on moving forward. Also, from an accountability standpoint, I think as Maggie mentioned, being transparent. We're committed to meeting quarterly with the EDI committee. So these community-based organizations, we're not going to just take the findings and then do the work internally, but we made a commitment to come back quarterly to our EDIA committee and talk about process. So we have an action plan, and every quarter we'll go to the 14 community-based organizations and share how well we're doing. What's going well, what are the challenges, but again, problem solving. If we're not able to make the progress we need to make, we're committed to work with them. And then again, as mentioned, we can modify that plan based upon our success. So moving forward, I turn it over to the superintendent.
Oh, thank you, Eric.
That's my sign. Yeah, I've worked with the superintendent long enough. I saw him moving on the side. So we have this timed really nicely now. So superintendent, would you like to end this? Or?
Thank you, Eric. It was well rehearsed. Let's give him a round of applause. I mentioned earlier that you have to have the foundation to do this work, and as a team, as colleagues, we've been working very hard to establish that trusting relationship, that communication, an awareness and understanding of who we are, what our biases are, and how that affects the people we work with directly. So very appreciative of the team. Both Maggie and Eric have done a phenomenal job of taking a very difficult subject and moving it forward, but it's one that we know is essential to our work, and I will again come back to as we describe some of those findings of those lived experiences of our staff. I have to go back to our students and say, if our staff members are feeling this, I believe our students are feeling this, and that to me is not acceptable. We have to change that. I'd like you to go back to that slide that had the 14 different organizations and just make sure people get a chance to see that. That in itself is a whole another session, but appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to what we had around our work this morning. It's not done. Our next presentation to the board in late January will be about what our action plans are, and we'll have metrics and measuring what we're going to do with that work. I am going to open it up for questions. We have a couple minutes. If anyone has any questions that we'd like to be able to respond to here, happy to take a few. Yes, if you'll introduce yourself and your organization and your question.
Adam Tillison from Wayzata. I was curious if the group has done any examination with your students of color who have experienced negative experiences in their schools because of the microaggression or biases, and whether that deters them from going into public education as a teacher.
Thanks, Adam. This is we've done I'm going to let Eric handle it, but just give you an overview. We have a number of different evaluation programs occurring in our district. Parent participatory evaluation, which is a great system that was set up, and then we also have student voice, student participation, evaluations as well. So, Eric, can you speak to some of the findings you've had from that work?
Right. So we have we established about 5 years ago called Youth Participatory Evaluation Groups. So these are groups of 8 to 10 students in each of our middle and high schools, in which we train our students in data collection and program evaluation methods, and they get to define topics that are of interest to them. And we use that in response to our Office of Civil Rights Agreement, now our MDRH agreement, Minnesota Department of Human Rights Agreement. But essentially, many students have looked at, they have a project that they engage in, and they present to each other at the end of the year. We were very cognizant to identify students who have been involved in our discipline system that may have struggled academically and behaviorally. But what's been interesting is that they all focus on across the district the importance of the relationship with the teacher. They talk about, similar to the EDIA findings, feeling valued and welcome and heard, issues of identity, opportunities for leadership. So a number have brought up how they feel treated in climate, and but I think what's exciting is that as part of that process, they spend time interviewing teachers. And I've had an opportunity to attend a couple of sessions where the students, I'm thinking of one particular school, they looked at recruitment and retention of teachers of color. So this is a middle school. They presented their findings to the staff. And they talked about not only the need to have more teachers of color, but also what white teachers could do to make them feel more supported and valued. We all know this. I mean, as students rise up to the level of expectations, and these students are doing original research on things they care about, which is teachers of color and white teachers, and making them the best students they can be. So we do have that structure in place. Again, that's taken about 5 years to do that. Recently we have a parent evaluation program. We also train our parents on program evaluation methods, data collection methods. We had 50 parents recently participate in that project, looking at what we could do to make them feel valued in our school district. They were able to reach 1,500 parents in Somali, American Indian, Hmong, Latino, African American families in their languages. They're doing high-level, rigorous data collection methods, and so same thing. It's identity, it's the curriculum, right? They want it. It's language. So a big theme there was interpretations, the extent to which they can participate fully based upon language. And so what we're trying to do is build a system of accountability with the EDIA, with the youth evaluation groups, the parent evaluation groups, a system of accountability where our high-level decisions and work that we're doing is driven by the systematic collection of youth and parent and community voice. And so these community-based organizations, the youth evaluation groups, the parent evaluation groups, allows us to make better decisions. And one of the things we plan on doing with the parent evaluation and youth evaluation data collection process is that's driving, and Maggie can speak to this, our professional development. So this year of the new teacher orientation, we presented a video that our middle school students did on how teachers could successfully educate them. And so, again, that feedback loop that we're establishing, where we're engaging with our youth and our communities and our parents and showing them that we're valuing their voices because they're allowing us, based upon their voices and sharing, to make our district better. It re-engages them. They see that we're actually using information and we're moving towards action. So that's some of the work that we're doing.
I would also add real quickly, we are launching our high school to teaching pathway, and a big part of that is unpacking kind of the student's experience as a student and what that means on their journey to become a teacher, really with a social justice lens. So that's going to be a critical part of that pathway.
Any other questions? Well, before we go into break, we do have a reflective question that we would like you to consider at your table. The question from this presentation is really, what can you take away from these findings and recommendations that could be useful for addressing similar challenges within your district? So again, hopefully sparring some different thoughts where you fit into this conversation as a district, and any of the findings that could be applied or would be helpful in addressing your work in your district.
My name is Eric Olson, Superintendent Monticello, and we were talking about just the challenges that we have if there's a shortage of teachers of color going into the profession, and we're more rural, and our student population, is growing, but it's still not very large or representative of the world. So, in order to gain and attract teachers of color, we have to use probably different strategies. I can learn from what you guys are doing in the training, but probably even different strategies, because they're going to stop at your school district, probably first. And so recruiting maybe within our own student body and looking at trying to get some scholarships going of our own students would maybe be something that we could do at our school.
Yeah, that's a great segue for the next session. That's part of what we're going to be talking about, is how districts can adapt some of these practices to their own work, and you'll hear from a number of your colleagues on what they're doing.